Dishonored 2 is an immersive sim action-adventure game released on the 11th of November 2016 for PC and 8th generation consoles, and is the sequel to the 2012 original. Developed primarily by Arcane Studios Lyon, the game entered early development sometime in 2013, while Arcane Studios Texas, the creators of the original game, worked on the DLC expansions before moving on to Prey. Arcane had wanted to have protagonist Corvo Attano fully voiced in the first game, but due to time and budget constraints were unable to achieve this. While working on the expansions Knife of Dunwall and the Brigmore Witches, they hired Michael Madsen to voice playable character Dowd. This flared up game director Harvey Smith's desperate want to give players a voiced Corvo, and so he began exploring potential story avenues that would allow the creation of more Dishonored content starring Corvo, before eventually settling on the idea of exploring Emily Caldwin's reign 15 years after the events of the first game. Looking back, the original Dishonored received enormous praise from journalists and players for its freedom of gameplay and player expression, as well as creative level design, the AI's ability to interact with the world and react to the player, and the audio-visual aspects. However, reviewers critiqued the pacing, with some feeling the quality of missions varied over the dozen hours of gameplay. Some also pointed to the story as a weak point, with hit or miss voice acting, immersion-breaking NPC dialogue, and an ending that didn't really tie things up neatly for many people, though this was addressed with DLCs. Unanimously though, journalists hated the game's attempts to railroad players into non-lethal methods of play. Not only was a pacifist playthrough limited in gadgets to just the sleeping darts, effectively locking players out of using the majority of items in the game, players were also unable to solve combat puzzles or side quest puzzles as they saw fit, forced instead to sneak around combat and to solve many puzzles by scouring the area for codes or keys. On top of this, they were also prevented from making full use of the game's magic system. Even while playing stealth using lethal methods, the game became significantly harder, and most likely earned you the bad ending of the two, through a mechanic called Chaos. Chaos increased the more enemies you killed, and if you reached above 20% of maximum Chaos, you would lose access to the good ending unless you proceeded to avoid or spare enemies to lower this percentage, and raising Chaos further saw the game become increasingly populated with infected enemies that made a lethal playstyle frustrating as level difficulty increased. Journalist Jake Munsey described Chaos in the first game as a kind of airsats morality meter that too often trapped the player in binaries, innocent pacifist or cutthroat murderer, without much space in between. So, when the team sat down at the design phases of Dishonored 2, their main goals were firstly to tackle the Chaos system, reinventing it to make players more aware of it and more engaged with it. Secondly, to try and make non-lethal play on par with lethal play in terms of difficulty, and lastly, to address the wonky player power curve by improving the skill tree and magic tree. For this review, to ensure that I was going in prepared, I replayed the original to get a good idea of the systems in place and form my own opinions on it, noting down what I wanted to see from the sequel before starting. I undertook a full Chaos playthrough and recalled as much of my original low Chaos pacifist run as I could. I noticed the HUD is lacking a lot of crucial information that would be easy to add. Combat felt extremely clunky, and I definitely got the idea that you were meant to be playing stealthily, whether that's lethal or non-lethal. I also didn't see a need to reinvent the full magic system, although I didn't like that in order to get runes you were forced into side quests, meaning your toolkit was directly restricted by how much side content you interacted with. Looking at the magic power specifically though, the dark vision power, which gives you improved situational awareness of enemies, was core to the gameplay, and should have had its own dedicated keybind and perhaps have worked as a buff that when on, reduced your total mana pool, or dark vision should have been reworked or nerfed entirely. Lastly, the ending felt extremely binary, and I'm not sure how much it took into account how I dealt with each mission's outcome. If my choices earlier in the game outside of Chaos made any difference, it wasn't visible. Upon starting a new game in Dishonored 2, the game presents you with 4 difficulty presets on top of a suite of customizable difficulty parameters, which is great, and seeing as this can be done after the tutorial, which is separate from the main game, it allows players to find a comfortable balance before they start. The customizable difficulty parameters have good descriptions of how each option affects gameplay, and how they compare to the normal difficulty mode, though a few are missing relevant descriptions. On top of this, you can enable a hard mode by choosing not to enable supernatural powers, though you won't get this option until the beginning of the second mission. The hard mode has an extremely minor story payoff, and personally I feel it greatly limited your scope of gameplay, because not only do you lose access to magic powers, but also more basic abilities like double jump. Unless you want to downgrade your experience, or this is your 5th run and you need to change it up somehow, I wouldn't recommend playing with this mode on at all, as it honestly just removes some of the fun of the game and serves to make playthroughs more tedious. After going through the opening cutscene, you will be given a choice in protagonists, which has both story and gameplay ramifications. Corvo maintains his supernatural powers from the first game, with some tweaks to make him more offensive, while Emily has a new, unique set of supernatural powers that make her the preferred choice for those wanting to focus on ghosting or pure stealth. I like that Arcane has sought to give you a better selection of powers for your playstyle, but I still feel, as I will later detail, that proper offensive playstyles are shunned by the overall game design. The core gameplay is much the same with some minor tweaks. You're still restricted to wielding your sword in one hand and a power or item in the other at any one time. Powers and the basic toolkit of a gun, crossbow, grenades and mines return, with some expansion to make grenades and mines more useful for non-lethal play. Full stealth has been made harder by limiting your number of sleep darts and stun mines drastically, and by changing enemy placement and enemy awareness to make it far harder to pick off guards using chokes. Runes are still the upgrade currency of the game, and bone charms can be collected to provide new passives to your character. However, bone charms have seen some tweaks. The corrupted bone charms return from the Brigmore Witches DLC. These are very powerful bone charms, but they have a negative attached to them. For example, they might increase your overall movement speed, but increase all damage taken. Black bone charms are a new type of bone charm in Dishonored 2, and are essentially cleansed versions of corrupted bone charms. Personally, I don't think the black bone charms were necessary, and this is something the new bone charm crafting system could have addressed. You can also now equip 5 by default instead of 3, and 10 when fully upgraded instead of 8. The world is more interactable now too. Alarm clocks can be set on a timer to lure out a guard while giving you time to hide, bottles and glasses can be thrown as a distraction or as a means of combat, and lethal items like bullets and grenades now serve a purpose for pacifist players in destroying objects to open up new areas. Level design has been made far more open and vertical, with more freedom in how you traverse a level. The missions are far more multi-stage than Dishonored 1, which occasionally saw you traverse a district, sometimes the same district, for multiple missions, while Dishonored 2 more often puts you into the outskirts of Karnaca, and has you then venture further inland if necessary through 1 or even 2 smaller levels. This has given the developers a bit more freedom to explore level design, and to detach runes and bone charms from long and tedious side objectives. Instead, they are now tied more heavily to exploration of these fantastic levels, though some will still require you to complete puzzles or do a small objective, but it generally isn't anywhere near as egregious as the side quests of the first game. The new ammunition limitations, the greater difficulty of stealth and thus harder reliance on your supplies, and the creation of smaller connected levels has tied the merchants of the game more directly with the gameplay. In Dishonored 1, you had Pierre at the Hound Pit's pub, and you could meet Griff early on, but outside of saving Griff, neither of the merchants particularly facilitated any gameplay besides being a place to dump your excess coins to upgrade your gear, or to top up on supplies before a mission. By comparison, the initial stages of most missions in Dishonored 2 will see you looking for a black market shop, and often these shops will have a small side quest attached, as well as selling runes and useful information or unlocks to direct you towards puzzles or smaller side quests later in the mission. Some shops can even be broken into if you can follow some clues, allowing you to pilfer their supplies. The fact that these shops are nestled within the levels and are rather frequent means you can return to them during a level, creating an ebb and flow between skipping enemies, sections of the level, and using minimal items while also collecting very little, or exploring in detail, dealing with a lot of enemies, expending a lot of supplies, and finding a lot of valuables. Black market shops contribute to the overall need for exploration, which seems to be one of the key goals with Arcane's level design here. Add on to this that side quests are no longer just handed to you prior to a mission via expository dialogue from characters, but must be sought out, and a lot of the smaller ancillary side quests do not even provide HUD markers or objectives, and it helps exploration and interactions within Karnaca feel more organic. Changes in level design have also made Ghost, Stealth Non-Lethal and Stealth Lethal playstyles more fun and creative, as you are now required to think more carefully about how you will traverse a level, how you deal with groups of enemies, and if necessary, where to hide unconscious or dead enemies. But I can't help but notice yet again that Arcane do not like players going aggressive, as the design ethos of both games now seems to cater towards players slinking about, either avoiding or neutralising enemies one by one. It kind of begs the question, why allow the player the freedom to deviate from stealth if the game feels so heavily based around it? In terms of the individual missions, I didn't feel any were particularly low points, unlike the Royal Position in Dishonored 1's latter half, which was an extremely confined and narrow mission that made stealth frustrating and combat limited, or even some of the later levels in the first game where you are retreading your steps across old uninspired levels. Dishonored 2's opening mission, set in Dunwall Palace, is open and provides you ample opportunities to explore gameplay systems and discover which playstyle is right for you, but is unnecessarily hard in my opinion. Mission 3 has you slinking about an island research facility, and there is a twist towards the latter half where I expected the boss of the level to begin stalking me about the level. But sadly this didn't happen, and I feel it was a missed opportunity to build tension and create a unique dynamic for all playstyles. Mission 4 in my opinion is especially good, possibly the high point, as it allows those aiming to perform a pacifist run to flex their combat skills if they so wish, without actually contributing to the kill count or chaos level, and is a fun puzzle style level. Mission 7 proves that Arcane can present quite effective horror through sound work and level design, even in a brightly lit area, as well as providing a time-bending twist which sees you stripped of your supernatural powers, and instead given an item to transition between variants of the level. The final two missions are rather straightforward, with Mission 8 being incredibly vertically stacked and a fun level to build a mental map of, with some difficult and rewarding puzzles, while the concluding mission is a worthwhile test of the skills you've acquired over the course of the game. Direct combat still feels clunky. There's no HUD elements to help you during sword fighting, such as a marker when an enemy is about to swing, and the animations do not telegraph enough in my opinion to make attack timings visually obvious either. There's certainly a learning curve here if you want to just start massacring the enemies. Even when tweaking combat via the customizable difficulty so that enemies are less likely to attack en masse, it still doesn't feel great. The only major improvement in sword fighting is the counter-attack period, which now allows you to non-lethally dispatch an opponent if you counter correctly, although this can be hard to successfully pull off when fighting multiple enemies. The supernatural powers as a whole have seen a rather large overhaul, and though I like the new powers and the upgrade system overall, I think it again feeds into the game's larger problem of dismissing a full lethal aggressive playstyle. In Dishonored 1 you had access to the following powers as shown on screen. The first 6 are active powers and the last 4 are passives. Of the active powers, 3 can be used offensively. However, bend time is extremely expensive, Wind Blast is risky and honestly not worth using in combat over just shooting an enemy, and Devouring Swarm only really works as a distraction to 1 or 2 targets at a time, making it either useless in group situations or trivialising combat in smaller encounters. The overall offensive capabilities of powers were often highly situational. Dishonored 2 does improve this somewhat, making powers useful in a wider variety of situations through a more flexible upgrade system. Each protagonist now has their own set of powers. Corvo has the same base set of powers as the first game, while Emily has a more stealth and distraction oriented set of powers. But this time around each ability has 2 or more upgrades which can, and I must stress this can, provide more unique effects than simply being a better version of the base ability. Bend time can now be used to speed Corvo up as well as slow down and freeze time, making it even more flexible between offense, defense and escape. Devouring Swarm through upgrades can summon more rats which can follow you, making them more mana efficient and more aggressive. Possession can now jump between controlled targets, making your ability to infiltrate locations while controlling someone far greater, and promoting the ability from its position in Dishonored 1 as the Vent/Great ability. Corvo's Blink has been given a time stop when in use, much like Dowd's Blink in Knife of Dunwall, as well as an offensive capability by allowing you to blink directly into a takedown. Emily shares Dark Vision with Corvo, and Dark Vision is something I will come back to later as it has been significantly reworked. The rest of her toolkit though is a lot more stealth and distraction focused, although there is some flexibility for offense. Domino allows her to link enemies, meaning causing damage, killing or knocking out one enemy will affect any other linked enemies, and upgrades allow you to link up to 4 enemies at once. Doppelganger creates shades that will chase and try to kill, and upgrades make this doppelganger able to assassinate, swap places with you, or even have up to 2 doppelgangers up at once. Far Reach is Emily's version of Blink, moving her in an arc and preserving her momentum if performed during movement. It is able to be upgraded to be reversed into a pull on target objects and even enemies, as well as slowing time like Corvo's Blink can. Mesmerize summons a spirit that acts as a basic stun, and upgrades make it last longer or stun more targets, and finally Shadow Walk makes you harder to spot and allows you to pass by most enemies unseen, and upgrades allow you to knock out more enemies in shadow form, move faster, and utilise vents or grates in this form. Finally, both protagonists can use Dark Vision, which thankfully has been changed from Dishonored 1, although they have gone the route of a rework, rather than my preferred fix, which would have been keeping it the same functionality, but making it cap your max mana dramatically while in use, potentially locking you out of strong spells like Bend Time while toggled. Dark Vision now works in pulses, meaning it cannot track enemies at all times, and the base range has been heavily nerfed. However, you can now upgrade it to show enemies' predicted movements, which adds an element of risk-reward to the system. You can now see where an enemy is going to move, and more effectively plan a takedown, but you do not have vision of them permanently, and it's harder to see if any other enemies are nearby and able to spot you. Passive or natural powers have also been expanded. Vitality, Bloodthirsty, Agility and Shadow Kill all return in practically the same form, with some minor adjustments, in some cases compartmentalising the Rank 2 versions from the previous game into separate upgrades. The new natural powers are Strength, which means that thrown objects can be used at greater range for distraction, or used as non-lethal knockout tools with a headshot or lethal weapons with a body shot, as well as making it possible to break through certain locked doors. Reflexes make fighting enemies more manageable by allowing you to block projectiles, parry easier, or slow time in crucial situations. Bone Charm crafting has the most potential of the new natural powers. It is a new risk-reward system that allows you to destroy existing regular Bone Charms to learn their bonuses. You can then craft Bone Charms with multiple bonuses consolidated into a single charm. However, the more bonuses you put onto a charm, up to 4, the higher the risk they become corrupted, meaning the Bone Charm will also have a harmful effect attached to it. On the face of it, this system looks interesting, but upgrades to the power make corruption less likely, and the fact that you're essentially just packing more bonuses into one rather than building your own unique passives wasn't much fun. I think if they wanted to create a more robust system, the bonuses should have been far more modular, allowing you to snap more unique effects together. For example, rather than the Whirlwind Charm and its destroyed trait just improving your sword's attack speed, destroying it could have given you the traits to improve the speed of any weapon or gadget, or to buff your sword damage. You could then destroy the Liquid Sustenance Charm, which provides health back when drinking from a fountain, and take the health restore component of this charm and combine it with the sword damage from Whirlwind, so that your sword restored a small portion of health when striking an enemy, or if you wanted, combine the other two effects, allowing you to drink from a fountain faster if that's what you really wanted. Essentially, you could make this system able to craft unique combinations that players can then experiment with, rather than it just be an extension of player power through a series of menus whose effects are the same as just adding more Bone Charm slots. I also think having Corrupted and Black Bone Charms, and not having them interact with this crafting system at all, was a waste. Corrupted Bone Charms should have been cleansable through the crafting system, and then converted into Black Bone Charms, rather than the black variants just being scattered around to collect. Arcane also should have made you use specialised slots for the different types of charms, rather than sharing the base 5 or upgraded 10 slots. Carrying 10 crafted 4-trait Bone Charms and or Black Bone Charms can lead to some extremely powerful and game-breaking builds in my opinion, although this isn't a major gripe as difficulty can be tweaked on the fly. On the whole, it's clear time has been taken with both types of powers to try and bring offensive play up to the same standards as other immersive sims, but unfortunately, due to the constraints of the level design, enemy placement and the core combat loop, I don't feel it was worthwhile making these changes. Even with all these tweaks, I think Arcane should have focused their efforts on creating other systems that enhance the stealth and sneaking aspects of the game, such as more traversal tools than just a supernatural teleport and a double jump, and by creating more unique ways to kill, disarm or knock out your enemies. For example, if we ignore Emily's far reach so that this is a universal ability between both protagonists, I think a versatile grapple hook would have been a great addition to the toolkit of all players. It could have been upgraded with extra range and could allow you to traverse gaps that supernatural powers could not, given an appropriate grappling point was available. It could also let you pull enemies up to their deaths, disarm ranged combatants, or fire the hook to drag bodies out of sight. Another viable avenue may have been to implement a robust trap system beyond just mines and spring razors, considering there are already traps in the game, and this would mesh well with the changes to enemy placement, as there is a need to draw enemies out from their groups to more easily overcome multiple foes. Instead, I feel development time was wasted fleshing out the weakest gameplay aspect without really bringing it up to the standards of the other three, which is a shame in my opinion and a missed opportunity to refine and streamline the formula with this sequel. I will say though, offensive combat itself is actually quite fun, in specific circumstances. The Bloodfly enemies are far more interesting than the rats of the first game, reacting only to sudden movements, but are also able to be de-aggroed by swiftly destroying nearby nests. The guards and elite guards still aren't much fun to fight. In groups they're a pain, even with tweaked group combat settings via the custom difficulty, and solo they're not even remotely a challenge no matter how high you crank the difficulty. Clockwork soldiers in my opinion are fantastic to fight, with weak points and interesting ways to weaken their offensive, defensive and reactive capabilities by attacking weak points, but it's let down by the fact that Arcane only introduced two kinds of these soldiers, a 2-armed variant and a 4-armed variant, which does more damage. So, to gradually increase the difficulty of the soldiers, they just begin placing them in groups with other Clockwork soldiers or more guards. Boss fights here are far more fun than in the first game, where they felt no different than a normal enemy. However, most bosses have a decent sized health pool and some unique abilities that make them fun to fight one-on-one, but they can be easily cheesed with stealth kills or takedowns, so it does feel a bit unrewarding to beat them in a straight duel. Other immersive sims like Prey and Deus Ex, even if stealth is sometimes the more optimal route, do nothing to particularly punish or hamper players who want to go out guns blazing, and many of their most exhilarating and tense moments can be experienced through a guns blazing approach. Arcane really should have decided on the proper way to play this game and stuck with it, especially considering we're one game and 2 DLCs into the series. Chaos, something director Harvey talked about extensively in interviews, really didn't feel that much better this time around. At least in the first game it had gameplay ramifications, albeit somewhat frustrating ones, but this time around it is pretty much purely a measure of which ending you'll get, good or bad. The endings this time around are much improved, but I just feel the chaos system on the whole was unnecessary yet again, and I would have preferred that the endings were tied more with how you chose to deal with antagonists of the game, be it lethally or non-lethally. Supposedly individual enemies now have their own miniature backstories told by the heart, which corresponds to how much chaos they are worth. One guard might be known for beating stray dogs, defining him as evil and worth low chaos to kill, while another may just work as a guard to make enough money to care for his sick mother, meaning killing him is an immoral choice and worth a lot of chaos. Considering the objective was to reinvent chaos from a morality system, I think the team at Arcane have done exactly the opposite, instead codifying even basic gameplay into these morality choices. Players are now asking themselves, do I kill this guard who's a good Samaritan? It's my only way to effectively reach that area ahead. Do I spare this character? They're busy searching for me, and if I just kill them, I can save myself 20 seconds of hiding in a corner. These are the thoughts going through players' heads if they bother to engage with the new chaos system, and in my opinion it doesn't really add any gameplay depth to the experience. A few odd mechanical issues are also present, some carryovers from the first game. Takedowns when approaching targets from behind are still a bit buggy, with the distance and angle from which you can perform a crouching or standing takedown being inconsistent, and sometimes the prompt doesn't show up at all, and even then you may be able to initiate the takedown even if the game doesn't prompt you. Placing unconscious bodies near destructible objects will cause the collision detection to go wild, and the destructible object will actually kill the unconscious person. While this is funny at first, this can be frustrating both because it will disrupt pacifist playthroughs, and the noise can attract other enemies and disrupt ghost playthroughs. For whatever reason, bullets are no longer lootable directly from incapacitated enemies like in the first game. Instead, the pistols are solid objects and you'll have to manually find and loot the guns. Bear in mind, they are actual objects in the game world, and as such physics interactions can send them flying all over the place. My last gripe is that yet again Arcane haven't really bothered to provide some meaningful information in the UI that really should be there. Health and mana potion counts are still only visible when opening the quick access menu, when there's literally no reason you couldn't just add a counter over each respective bar in the HUD. And I would have really liked to have seen some visual feedback notifying me if I have failed a pacifist or ghost rating during a level. For example, during Mission 3 I was sure I killed absolutely nobody, only for the summary screen to inform me I'd killed 4 enemies during the level, unbeknownst to me. From an audio-visual perspective, the game truly stands out. It is graphically stunning, and I think the art style is really going to help Dishonored 2 remain a good-looking game many years into the future. The issues of the first game, predominantly the low-res textures and low-res models or material work, have been completely resolved, with textures suitably detailed while maintaining the art style, and characters, clothing and objects looking sharp and defined. There was the occasional graphical issue with lighting and shadows, though it wasn't anything too distracting, and on PC I had to disable bloom as it was making dark vision glaringly bright. The game also has a 120 FPS cap on PC, and if it were to be unlocked it would break the physics, but honestly 120 FPS is more than good enough. The voice work is a real treat. A lot of recognisable and big name actors as well as great voice actors are present here. Erica Luttrell plays Emily Caldwin and prolific voice actor Stephen Russell plays Corvo. Of the two, Luttrell provides the better performance, with a far more cutting and resentful portrayal of Emily, with Russell's Corvo feeling unnecessarily restrained and flat. The standout voice is undoubtedly screen actor Vincent D'Onofrio's Duke Luca Abel. Although D'Onofrio doesn't have a great range as a voice actor, sounding no different from himself in Daredevil as Fisk, his inflection and intent here is clear in his voice, carrying undercurrents of superiority and menace, but also of front, covering frailty and insecurity. Erin Cottrell's Delilah is somewhat menacing and ruthless, but lacked a scathing edge for me. The worst performance, although still acceptable, was Robin Lord Taylor's Outsider. In the original game, Billy Lush provided the Outsider's voice, and his performance had an anger and bitterness to it that Taylor lacks, instead replacing emotion with an almost comical raspiness. Just listen for yourself though, and see what you think.
Your life has taken a turn, has it not? The Empress is dead, her precious daughter Emily is lost somewhere in the city, and you will play a pivotal role in the days to come. For this I have chosen you, and drawn you into the void.
Corvo, old friend, do I even have to say it? You've lost another Empress. Delilah was born a pawn, but now she's got the throne.
Daniel Licht returns for the soundtrack, and in my opinion his work here is far more impressive than even the first game. There is the continuation and refinement of a distinct style here, with heavy use of metallic and shrill instruments to give a sense of cold industry, urgency, and cruelty to the soundtrack. My only disappointment is that the music during gameplay always takes a backseat. I would have liked to have seen a more dynamic music system that allowed battle music or critical themes to really take centre stage among the soundscape. The Foley is fine but nothing special, and everything has been mixed rather low so that the key stealth elements like voices and enemy movement can be more precisely heard. There are some issues with the 3D audioscape, especially voices up close to the camera, where I really struggle to hear the voice correctly balanced between left and right channels, and sometimes a slight tilt in the camera would see a massive decrease in voice volume or panning between the channels. From a technical standpoint, the game is just above average. The PC version has a comprehensive and rounded options menu, with FOV slider, frame rate control, dynamic resolution scaler and accompanying frame rate target, frame rate cap options, and fully rebindable keys. As mentioned, the game caps out at 120 FPS, but this is fine, and with support for borderless and windowed mode as well as good aspect ratio and resolution support, it's well customizable on PC. I was lucky enough to go 30 hours without encountering any major glitches, save for a single crash. However, the game's kill cam system seems to introduce considerable stuttering for whatever reason. I don't know whether this is because of the depth of field effect being ludicrously demanding for some unknown reason, or that the game is achieving slowdown by literally just running the physics and game at a lower internal frame rate. On a 5700 XT, I was seeing 120 FPS at 1080p max settings when indoors or in smaller hubs, and at the lowest the game dropped to 70 FPS during large vista shots. At the lower end, I've seen others run the game on a Ryzen 2200G with the integrated graphics, and get frame rates and resolutions comparable to the lowest end console version, hovering around 30 FPS and 900p. There is room for optimization certainly, but I think by tweaking the settings, PC players will be able to find a comfortable compromise between visuals and frame rate with passable optimization. The console versions, as reported by Digital Foundry, shakes out to run around targeted 30 FPS on all consoles, with some dips to 20 FPS during vista scenes out of combat. The Xbox One and One S have the most severe drops during gameplay, while the PS4 is generally free of these issues. All consoles make use of the dynamic resolution system in order to try and hit the 30 FPS target, and they only seem to scale resolution in the vertical axis. Xbox One X runs at 3840 by 2160, though I can't find any info on the resolution scaling for this console. The PS4 Pro version runs at 2560 by 1440, with very minor changes in the vertical resolution. Base PS4 runs between 1920 by 1080 and 1700 by 1080, and lastly the Xbox One and One S version run between 1600 by 900 and 1280 by 900. Personally, I think 30 FPS is the wrong target for Dishonored 2 and the pace of its gameplay, but judging by how hard all consoles struggle to maintain 30 FPS, it seems the team didn't have much of a choice. The world building in game is excellent, and this feels like a rich enough universe that Arcane could easily spin off into comics, TV shows or movies if they wanted to without having to start from scratch. But it also suffers from the same pitfalls as the first game, in that the level driven story here is quite weak, and in my opinion Dishonored 2 struggles even more than its predecessor. Each level feels disjointed, and without the loyalists of the first game to direct you, it feels like individual self-contained stories loosely strung together with a flimsy narrative that sees you moving from MacGuffin to MacGuffin, villain to villain. There's a lack of overarching presence like in Dishonored 1, where it felt like you were fighting against the traitorous spy master and then the turncoat loyalists. But in Dishonored 2, you're in a foreign land fighting enemies who have yet to step foot back in Dunwall. It feels weak and a little contrived. It's a real shame, because the main antagonist is a far more interesting and cunning villain than the Lord Regent Hiram Burrows, Dowd, or the loyalist traitor Havelock. And if they'd integrated her more into the story and used her as more of a driving force for Emily or Corvo's actions, then I feel the pacing would have been far better and the motives of the protagonists far more convincing. I feel the overarching plot, mostly due to its structure, was weaker than Dishonored 1's, even though the individual characters and world were an improvement, and the building blocks of a good story are present. That said, Arcane did a far better job here of providing payoff to your choices with a much more satisfying ending. There are 3 primary outcomes related to your chaos level, as well as 5 possible post-ending scenes that reflect your choices in the game. Dishonored 2 is a worthwhile sequel. For those looking to continue the story, the sequel provides enough to get your teeth into that you'll at least be satisfied with this entry into the franchise, and in my opinion does enough to set up the spin-off, Death of the Outsider, that by the end I was excited to start playing it. I think a lot of the best twists and turns here do lean a bit too heavily on information only players of the DLCs will know, but the core story has enough to keep even newcomers to the franchise entertained. Gameplay wise, it's more of an evolution than revolution, refining what exists without really fixing the core issues of the previous game and adding a few bloated and unnecessary systems along the way. But the core stealth gameplay loop is still excellent, bettered by the improved level design and tweaks to your magic powers. Multiple protagonists, a new game plus mode and more meaningful choices make this game replayability far improved from the first, as well as a focus on exploration leading to longer and more enjoyable playthroughs. As of writing, the game is around $20 for all platforms, and for that price I would say it's well worth buying. It's not perfect, but it does a damn good job of providing more of the gameplay fans of the first game loved. Before ending this review, I really want to talk about the story in a bit more depth, so spoilers ahead. I want to preface the narrative discussion though with a quick tangent on the villains of the game. I think the way in which Delilah was handled is a bit ham-fisted. She is clearly a far more motivated and developed villain than anything in the first game, excluding DLCs obviously, or even the Duke of Psychonos here in Dishonored 2, and Arcane did a lot to play up her mistreatment at the hands of Jessamine and the Cold Winds. As a result, I feel the binary choice at the end of the game to let her live trapped in the painting, or to simply kill her, was another missed opportunity with the story to do something interesting. Playing into the chaos system, I think a redemption option where you let Delilah live and either reform her as low chaos or wield her as a weapon of the crown against Emily's enemies in high chaos could have added an extra dimension to the character and a bigger payoff to her story. Personally, I felt somewhat sorry for Delilah no matter what, although when you see the state of Dunwall in the final mission, Delilah does come across as comic book villain levels of ludicrously evil. With that out of the way, a look at the narrative issues of the game are rather pertinent in my opinion. Most games with a solid story follow the archetypal hero's journey, a narrative tool that is core to many popular pieces of fiction, and so I'll be using this as the framework to break down the story of both games and compare them. Looking first at Dishonored 1, we have a modicum of setup. Corvo is back in Dunwall after asking neighbouring nations for help against the rat plague. Refused and turned away, he returns to his Empress in shame. It's short, but it does a lot to create initial conditions for the story. Dunwall is in a state of quickly devolving pandemic, and its steampunk science is unable to challenge this. Corvo is at a low point. Then we have the inciting incident. Dowd assassinates Empress Jessamine Colwyn, and Corvo is framed by the Lord Regent Hiram Burrow as part of an elaborate coup to seize power by Hiram. We see rising action as Corvo takes out the High Overseer, leader of the religious faction who enforces Hiram's regime, before rescuing Emily and dealing with the Pendletons, aristocratic beneficiaries to the Lord Regent. He then captures Sokolov, the scientific advisor to Hiram, and takes care of Lady Boyle, lover and financier of the Lord Regent. The climax occurs midway through the story, where Corvo finally deposes the Lord Regent, only for his loyalist allies to turn against him, seizing power from the Lord Regent, taking Emily hostage in the process, and attempting to poison Corvo and kill him. The story begins to resolve and the action winds down as Corvo meets with Dowd, the hired assassin who killed the Empress, and decides whether he should be held responsible for her death before returning to the Loyalist base and learning the location of the Turncoats. Finally, a resolution is reached when Corvo saves Emily and ends the treachery of the three leaders of the Loyalist plot. Although Corvo is predominantly a passive protagonist, working with Havelock and the Loyalists to achieve their goal, you are given a good reason to undertake each mission, to undermine and isolate the Lord Regent. And then, when the climax occurs and you become a more active protagonist, the player is already motivated, just as Corvo is, for revenge or retribution. Dishonored 2 by comparison seems to have no setup. We do not see Emily or Corvo ruling the Isles together, and from what the intro cinematic tells us, life in Dunwall is fairly okay and Emily's reign is doing just fine. The Crown Killer is set up in the cinematic as a rather substantial antagonist, something which isn't properly paid off in the story as they are swiftly dealt with, and seems to detract from the real antagonist of the game. Instead, the story begins in media res with the inciting incident, as Delilah and her benefactor, the Duke of Sokonos, accuse Emily of being the Crown Killer, and they use this excuse to dethrone her and install her supposed aunt Delilah as the rightful ruler. We then see rising action as Corvo or Emily escape to Sokonos aboard the Dreadful Wale. Once south, they infiltrate Adamire Institute in search of Sokolov and deal with the real Crown Killer there, before finding a lead to Anton Sokolov's true captor, the Duke's own scientific advisor, Kieran Jindosh, and finally they are tasked with taking out Brianna Ashworth, a witch who has been meddling with the religious organisations to instill support for Delilah. These events are strung together by the conclusion of the previous one, and it doesn't feel like any of these story beats are being significantly set up. The reason to go to Adamire is to rescue Sokolov initially, but it's not really clear why we need Sokolov besides he's smart, he'll know what to do to defeat Delilah. And then, when you discover he's not at Adamire, we need to head to Jindosh's mansion where we rescue him, only for it to have very little payoff and he's unable to provide us anything concrete to use against Delilah other than yet another target, this time Brianna Ashworth. After dealing with Brianna, we head to a manor in the Dust District, because it's linked to Delilah's secret, or some other tenuous story reason. What you might call a climax is a rather placid and uneventful reveal. We must infiltrate the seclusive home of Aramis Stilton, who is linked to Delilah's return after Dowd sealed her in the Void 15 years ago. If you haven't played Brigmore Witches, you won't know Delilah was ever trapped in the Void. If you've been attentively reading books and notes, at most you'll only know that she's been mysteriously quiet for a period beginning when the Empress Jessamine was assassinated and lasting until 3 years prior. If you have played Brigmore Witches, well, of course she returns from the Void, you see her in the game. Either way, we discovered Delilah managed to survive her stay in the Void, and learned of a way to link her spirit with the Outsiders, and this fragment of her spirit makes her immortal. If you do not wish to consider this the climax, then the story pacing is relying far too heavily on build-up, and surely cannot maximise on payoff, and if you do consider this the climax, it doesn't really do much to surprise, excite or upset the player. We learn nothing the player couldn't readily deduce, other than that Delilah has a plot armour which we must remove before we can defeat her, something that is technically knowable during the very first mission, when Corvo stabs Delilah in the chest to no effect. After this, we see falling action as Corvo or Emily infiltrates the Duke's palace. We depose of him, and are forced to let go of the last vestige of Jessamine Caldwin, residing in the heart of the Outsider, in order to defeat Delilah. We also get another plot twist if playing on low chaos. The captain of the Dread Wale, Megan Foster, is really Billy Lurk, second in command to Dowd's Whalers, who took part in the assassination of Jessamine. But again, this feels like a story beat meant for those who played the DLCs, and falls a little flat if you haven't. Not only does Dishonored 2 miss initial story beats or stick the landing of others, I also think that Arcane and the writers have tried to create a mini arc within each mission by changing the flow of missions, as I mentioned previously when talking about level design. Each mission has its own setup, a period of discovery and adventure, a revelation or climax, followed by an unravelling of the mystery or creation of a solution, and then a resolution as you complete the mission and return to the Dreadful Wale. It's odd, because the story itself has far more focus than Dishonored 1, which was trying to tell several smaller side stories parallel to the main one, predominantly that of the Outsider and his followers like Granny Rags, and of the brewing territory wars between the Hatters, the Bottle Street Gang, and Dowd's assassins, the Whalers. Dishonored 2 by comparison focused pretty strictly on its main story, and anything else we're told is retrieved through audio logs, books, and notes, and contribute towards developing existing characters or providing further world building. There is a small side plot with a gang called the Howlers feuding with the Overseers, but even that becomes a plot MacGuffin to feed the main story. I think Dishonored 2's narrative needed some necessary restructuring to make it work. Firstly, the opening mission should have focused on Corvo or Emily dealing with threats to the Empire and the Crown, that being the disappearance of Sokolov and the threat of the Crown Killer. Whichever protagonist you don't choose is abducted by the forces responsible for the Crown killings and Sokolov's disappearance. Through exploring these three issues, we can see the cracks beginning to form in Emily's reign, and a build-up of antagonists as we find Sokolov being held by Jindosh, and the player begins to find out who Jindosh works for, and provides us leads towards the Crown Killer. Then, you deal with the Crown Killer, and sprinkle in enough notes and periphery storytelling along the way that attentive players can realise that Delilah, or at least a powerful witch as far as the players know, is controlling the Duke and behind the attacks on Corvo and Emily's friends, and the attempt to weaken Emily's legitimacy. The climax would be the coup attempt and the reveal of Delilah. For DLC players, this then becomes a relevant revelation, and for non-DLC players it's just another interesting twist as they are probably expecting only the Duke of Serkonos. We then flee to Serkonos proper and investigate Aramis's mansion to find out how Delilah can be stripped of her power and a way to defeat her. Armed with this knowledge, you destroy the conspiracy itself by dealing with the Duke, and finally you defeat Delilah and save Corvo or Emily.